Welcome to a bonus episode of the Blooms and Barnacles podcast. It's bonus episode number 16 overall and number 4 of our series on Dubliners. And this month we're covering The Boarding House and A Little Cloud, which I'm excited because I feel like we're getting into like the good Dubliners stories. I don't know if that's a controversial remark, but they're not all created equally. These are two, I think, top shelf Dubliners stories. We'll find out if Dermot agrees. All right. So the first one up we're going to talk about today is called The Boarding House. And I want Dermot to give just a quick back of the envelope synopsis of The Boarding House.
As was the style of the time, they had boarding houses where young bachelors could stay in a respectable dwelling. The landlady would provide lodgings and food because these young men would be incapable of feeding themselves. And they would have probably, depending on the landlady, various strictures against fornication, ladies of the night, and so forth. So there would be a no fap, no shagging.
This is already taking a dark turn.
But the good news is that this boarding house is
doesn't have that.
It's a little more liberal socially, let us say.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes. The young men, I think, are allowed some privileges.
Okay.
I think that's the impression I got. They would have social events and gather. It was a house of some reputation. Let's just say it's mentioned in the story.
Do you remember the person who owns the boarding house?
Mrs. Doran. Is this?
Mrs. Mooney.
Mooney. Yeah. Okay.
Mrs. Mooney.
And her lovely daughter.
Do you remember her daughter's name?
Mrs. Mooney Jr.
Polly Mooney.
Polly Mooney. Polly Mooney is a funny name.
Yeah.
So, and they have all these young men, and they all have their eye on the young woman.
And there's one in particular.
And I forget his name, just the young man who gets nabbed. And he's going to appear in Ulysses.
Yes, and we will cover that. Because I'm guessing most of our listeners will be aware of Bob Doran's turn in Ulysses, but you are not. So it'll be fun to watch Dermot react to that, I think.
I have the gist
Bob,
of it, though.
Bob Doran.
Yeah, Doran.
Bob
That's
Doran.
the Doran, yes. Yeah. Now, Mrs. Mooney's husband was dissolute. Like, he sounds like a real...
Mr. Mooney.
Mr. Mooney sounds like
we'll
a
talk about him.
Piece of shite.
Yeah.
And she, like, to be fair to her, like, she's done her best with a bad hand.
What business was she in before she was in the boarding house?
Was it a butcher shop or something like that? Yeah.
There's this great line in it, and I want to make sure I say it just right, that it gets repeated basically every article you read about the story. Mrs. Mooney dealt with problems as a cleaver deals with meat. I think Mrs. Mooney is what might be uncharitably described as an old battle axe.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a misogynistic term, but it's...
I would consider this story like Pride and Prejudice, the Irish edition.
Okay, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, it's like this woman has to get her daughter married off. Some poor schlub's going to get nabbed. And so it's Pride and Prejudice, sir. And so she allows, basically, I think, turns a blind eye to her daughter getting...
Does she start wanting to marry Polly off?
I am not entirely sure.
So the way it went, as you know, she's got another child too. Do you remember her son?
Oh, yeah. Barely mentions him. He's mentioned once, I think. And very vaguely.
It's a bit of a Dudley Dursley figure in my mind.
Yeah.
Jack Mooney, who does actually play a very important role in the story that we'll come to. So she starts off, she has this daughter. She doesn't initially look to marry her off. She looks to put her to work.
Right.
She sends her to the office of a corn factor. Which I do find that interesting because the Usher's Key house where the dead takes place in real life was built by a corn factor in the 18th century.
Right.
Which is really immaterial to the story. I just think that's interesting. She goes there, and why does Polly have to cease working as a corn factor secretary? The reason's not funny. I just think that sentence is funny. Do you remember?
I forget now.
Because her estranged father finds her there.
Oh, okay.
And is coming into work and talking to her.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's no good for Mrs. Mooney. So she pulls Polly out of work. And is like, well, I have to do something with this precocious child. So she lets her perform for all the single men in the boarding house and just waits for the inevitable course of affairs.
She has to know what's going to happen.
Yes, she's an attractive young woman, flirty and outgoing, described as looking like a perverse Madonna, which is an incredible turn of phrase as well.
Yeah.
Of looking like the BVM, but
But up for it.
Above a MILF. Is that a gentlemanly blasphemy, or is that...
It's just a blasphemy.
Basically, her plan works for her. And then in the second half of the story, we get kind of Bob Doran's point of view. What about Bob Dermot?
He's older than her. She's 19. Bob is 33.
He's in his 30s. I don't remember exactly, but he's like early to mid 30s.
Okay. So yeah, he kind of has a moment of weakness. She's clearly sort of like made moves. He's not like exploited her. She's got agency.
Yeah, I would push back on that a little. I think they are mutually attracted.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's what I mean. Like he's not like none of them are doing anything they don't want to do.
The one thing and I don't think that you're saying this, Dermot, but it's a pretty common line of.
Yeah.
I don't think that Polly knows she's, another gross term, a honeypot.
Yeah.
I don't think she knows what her mother is up to.
No.
I think she's just like, well, I don't have to go to that boring secretary job anymore, but I can sing and dance and flirt with the boys because she's an outgoing, flirty 19-year-old girl, which is not a bad thing to be. It's just a neutral thing. And we might be getting ahead of ourselves here, but I don't think she's in on her mother's plots.
No, I don't think so either. No.
When we talked about 2 gallons last time, there was at least one article I read that talked about these as 2, foil stories, or they're bookends, or not bookends because they're nothing in the middle, but they're similar, right? The 2 gallons is 2 men defrauding a woman, and this is 2 women defrauding a man. But I think it's one dungeon mistress playing everyone off against each other to get what she wants.
Yeah.
We've talked a bit about ellipsis. Do you remember the term ellipsis?
Yeah, leaving things out.
This story is very elliptical. There's a lot of ellipsis in this. It was pointed out to me in one article I read that none of the main actions take place on page.
Yeah.
They're all described after the fact.
Yeah.
The meeting of Polly and Bob, their courtship, the act of getting it on, them getting caught, being confronted, the engagement, everything is off page. It's just people's memories and reactions and thoughts of everything. And the final scene do you remember the final scene of the boarding house?
So he's seen Polly in her room. She's crying, and he leaves. Once he leaves, she kind of, it's fine.
She kind of goes,
He goes downstairs. He passes one of the other lodgers on the way up, who kind of knows, oh God, you got.
He's going to the executioner.
You're in to be snapped. Downstairs is his employer and Mrs. Mooney. And I think they're going to do a deal. Don't fire him. We'll make an honest woman to my daughter. Blah blah blah.
There's an unwritten implication as well, because Bob confesses all of his sins to his priest.
Yes,
is that Mrs. Mooney is in the back pocket of the priest as well. That she knows more. She knows all the gory details because she probably through, I would say, fiscal bribery, got the information out of the priest who was,
If the priest broke the seal of the confessional, that's an unforgivable sin.
Well, we've already met priests in these stories it's been heavily implied have committed unforgivable sins. Yeah. So that's just a running theme through all the works of Joyce. So
that's like a priestly equivalent of a HIPAA violation.
Yeah.
The only time a priest is allowed to break the seal is if you go in and say, I am going to kill somebody. The priest is allowed, I believe, to go, right, that you're telling me something in the future. This isn't a sin you've done in the past. If you told me you murdered your wife, I can't go to the police about that. But if you tell me you're going to murder your wife, you better bloody believe I can walk to the police station and turn you in.
Well, in a story that's largely, the fourth character in the story is economic desperation. So I think everyone's actions in this are influenced heavily by economic desperation. Again, we'll give historical context for this, which I think to me has again been one of the most interesting parts of it. I would say the priest as well, maybe it's on the take. I think that is that's certainly implied. We're only guessing all of this. We have to guess pretty much everyone's intentions and beliefs. And so I think it's easy to look. I want to get back to Polly when she kind of slumps against the headboard and smiles. We can read into that complicity, but we don't actually know what she thinks about literally anything, because we at no point ever get to hear her thoughts. She might have just been worried that she's in a lot of trouble with her mom. Is she going to get thrown out? Is this guy going to do her dirty? When she knows that he's kind of going to be the honorable man, it could just be relief on her part. It's not necessarily like, oh, he's fallen into my web, because I think the spider is Mrs. Mooney and Polly's another fly in the web. What do you think? You feel free to disagree with me on any of this too.
I read it as she was complicit. I have to be
Yeah,
honest.
I did too. But when I read the story in the past, but I think you're meant to. But I think it's worth looking at it too, and to say, what do we actually know? Because that's why this idea of ellipsis is so important to look at in each of these stories, because we are filling in a lot of gaps, and this story has some huge gaps in it.
Yeah.